January 17th, 1957. 2:43 p.m. Interrogation Room 3, Manhattan District Attorney's Office, 155, Leonard Street. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson sat in a metal chair, his wrists cuffed to the table in front of him, his tailored gray suit slightly wrinkled from 6 hours in NYPD custody. Across from him sat Assistant District Attorney Martin Rothstein, 38 years old, Yale law graduate, ambitious prosecutor with a conviction rate that made defense attorneys nervous and criminals careful. Rothstein had been building a case against Bumpy for 14 months. Wiretaps, surveillance, informant testimony, financial records that traced money through a dozen shell companies. He believed he finally had enough to put away Harlem's most powerful numbers operator for 5 to 7 years on racketeering charges. "Mr. Johnson, I'm going to be straight with you," Rothstein said, sliding a folder across the table. "We have 17 witnesses who will testify you run illegal gambling operations across Harlem. We have financial records showing over $2 million in unreported income. We have recordings of conversations where you discuss criminal activity. This case is airtight." Bumpy looked at the folder but didn't touch it. At 52 years old, he'd been arrested 49 times. He knew this dance better than Rothstein knew his law degree. "I'm offering you a deal," Rothstein continued. "You plead to lesser charges, provide information about your Italian mob connections, specifically about Genovese family operations in Harlem, and we'll recommend 3 years instead of 7. You'll be out in 18 months with good behavior. And if I refuse, then we go to trial, you lose, and you spend the rest of your 50s in Sing Sing." Bumpy was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I want to make a phone call. You'll get your call after you talk to a lawyer. Speaking of which," Rothstein gestured to a man standing near the door. "This is Leonard Weiss, public defender assigned to your case. He's very good. Graduated top of his class at—" "I don't want a lawyer." The room went silent. Rothstein blinked. "I'm sorry, I don't want a lawyer. I'm refusing legal representation. Mr. Johnson, I strongly advise against." "I don't need your advice. I'm invoking my right to represent myself." Leonard Weiss stepped forward, his face concerned. "Mr. Johnson, representing yourself in a federal racketeering case is legal suicide. The law is complex. The procedures are. I understand the risks. I'm still refusing counsel." Rothstein leaned back in his chair, and something flickered across his face. Not concern, but satisfaction. Almost amusement. Here was Ellsworth Johnson, legendary Harlem operator, about to walk into court without legal representation against one of Manhattan's best prosecutors. It was going to be a massacre. Detective Sergeant William Murphy, who'd been standing against the wall observing, actually chuckled. "You're making a mistake, Bumpy. A big one." "Maybe," Bumpy replied calmly. "But it's my mistake to make. Now, I want my phone call. That's a constitutional right that doesn't require a lawyer to invoke." Rothstein nodded to Murphy. "Give him his call. Let him dig his grave deeper." They escorted Bumpy to a payphone in the hallway, still cuffed, with Murphy standing close enough to overhear. Bumpy picked up the receiver and dialed a number from memory, 7 digits, Manhattan Exchange. The phone rang twice before someone answered. Bumpy said, "This is Ellsworth Johnson. I need to speak with him. Now." Pause. "I understand he's busy. Tell him it's urgent. Tell him I'm in custody at the DA's office, and I need his help." Longer pause. Then Bumpy's expression changed slightly. Not relief exactly, but satisfaction. "Thank you. I'll wait for his call." He hung up and looked at Murphy. "I'm done. Take me back." "That's it? That's your big phone call?" "That's all I needed." Murphy led him back to the interrogation room, smirking. "You called a friend? A associate? You think someone's going to bust you out of federal case?" "I called someone who'll help." "Who?" Bumpy smiled slightly. "You'll find out." They returned to Interrogation Room 3. Rothstein was reviewing notes, preparing his next approach. Bumpy sat down, still calm, still unhurried. "Your call accomplish anything useful?" Rothstein asked. "We'll see." Rothstein laughed. Actually laughed. Mr. Johnson, I admire your confidence, but you're delusional if you think one phone call is going to change your situation. You're going to trial without a lawyer against the full resources of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. This ends one way, with you in prison. Maybe, Bumpy said again. Or maybe you don't understand who you're dealing with. Oh, I understand perfectly. You're a criminal who's run Harlem for 30 years through violence and extortion. But that ends today. At 3:17 p.m., 34 minutes after Bumpy made his phone call, there was a knock on the interrogation room door. A secretary poked her head in, looking flustered. Mr. Rothstein? There's a call for you. Line 2. They said it's extremely urgent. I'm in the middle of. It's from the DA's office. Mr. Hogan's office specifically. They insisted you take it immediately. Frank Hogan was the Manhattan District Attorney, Rothstein's boss's boss. Rothstein's face tightened with irritation, but he stood. I'll be right back. He left the room. Bumpy sat quietly, his expression unchanged. Murphy watched him with growing unease, sensing that something was happening that he didn't understand. 3 minutes later, Rothstein returned. His face had gone pale. His confident swagger was gone. He walked slowly to the table and sat down, staring at Bumpy with an expression somewhere between disbelief and fury. Who did you call? Rothstein asked, his voice barely controlled. Someone who could help. Who did you call? Bumpy leaned back as much as the cuffs allowed. That's privileged information, but I'm guessing you just learned that this interrogation is over. Rothstein's jaw clenched. You're being released. All charges dropped. Immediately, Detective Murphy straightened from the wall. What? We have 17 witnesses' financial records. I'm aware of what we have, Detective. We're releasing him anyway. On whose authority? On authority that supersedes mine. Murphy looked between Rothstein and Bumpy, understanding dawning. You called someone. Someone political. Someone with enough juice to kill a federal racketeering case with one phone call. Bumpy said nothing, just smiled that knowing smile that had made him legendary in Harlem. Rothstein stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Uncuff him. Get him his property. He's free to leave. Boss, if we let him walk after 14 months of investigation. I don't care. Uncuff him. Now. The cuffs came off. Bumpy rubbed his wrists, stood, straightened his suit jacket. He looked at Rothstein with something like pity. You thought you were untouchable, didn't you? You thought having evidence and witnesses and the full weight of the DA's office meant automatic victory. Get out, Rothstein said through gritted teeth. You forgot something important, Mr. Rothstein. In New York, law and power aren't the same thing. You have the law, but I have the power, and power always wins. Bumpy walked out of Interrogation Room 3 at 3:24 p.m., 41 minutes after making a single phone call that had destroyed a 14-month investigation and sent one of Manhattan's best prosecutors home humiliated and defeated. Nobody was laughing anymore. What happened in those 41 minutes? Who Bumpy called? What was said? What pressure was applied to force the DA's office to drop charges? Would remain one of the most debated mysteries in New York criminal justice history. But to understand it, you need to understand who Bumpy Johnson was in 1957. Not the street enforcer from the 1930s. Not just a numbers runner, but a man who'd spent 3 decades building relationships with judges, politicians, and power brokers that made him more politically connected than most elected officials. This is the story of one phone call that demonstrated something prosecutors would learn the hard way, that Bumpy Johnson's real power wasn't in his criminal enterprise. It was in knowing exactly who to call when the law tried to destroy him. By January 1957, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had been a fixture of Harlem for 38 years. But what most people, including Assistant DA Martin Rothstein, didn't understand was that Bumpy's power in 1957 looked nothing like his power in the 1930s. The young Bumpy who'd worked as an enforcer for Stephanie St. Clair, who'd fought Dutch Schultz's attempted takeover of Harlem's numbers racket, who'd used muscle and reputation to build influence. That man was gone. In his place was something far more sophisticated, a political operator who understood that lasting power comes not from violence, but from relationships, leverage, and information. Bumpy's evolution had been gradual and deliberate. In the 1940s, he'd started investing in legitimate businesses, real estate primarily, but also nightclubs, restaurants, and small commercial properties. These businesses served dual purposes. They laundered money from illegal operations, and they created connections with lawyers, accountants, bankers, and city officials who approved licenses and permits. Every interaction became an opportunity to build relationships. Every lawyer who handled a property transaction got to know Bumpy as a successful businessman, not a criminal. Every accountant who managed his legitimate holdings saw financial sophistication, not gangster crudeness. Every city official who processed his applications saw a Harlem entrepreneur creating jobs and paying taxes. By the 1950s, Bumpy had cultivated relationships across New York's power structure that made him nearly impossible to prosecute successfully. He knew judges, not through corruption necessarily, but through social connections, political donations, community events. He knew politicians at every level, city council, state legislature, even congressmen who represented Harlem and needed black votes. Most importantly, he knew things. He knew which politicians had affairs, which judges had gambling debts, which prosecutors had career ambitions that required political support. And he kept meticulous records of everything, not to blackmail people overtly, but to have leverage when needed. This was the man Martin Rothstein had tried to prosecute in January 1957. Not a simple criminal, but a sophisticated political operator with connections that ran deeper than the DA's office understood. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office in 1957 was led by Frank Hogan, who'd held the position since 1942. Hogan was legendary, incorruptible, brilliant, with a conviction rate above 90%. He prosecuted mob bosses, corrupt politicians, and every variety of criminal New York produced. His office had 170 assistant district attorneys, the best legal talent in the city. But Hogan's office operated within political realities. The DA was appointed by elected officials. His budget came from the city. His high-profile cases required political support to pursue effectively. And that meant that certain pressures, the right pressures from the right people, could influence decisions even in cases that seemed airtight. Bumpy understood this. Rothstein didn't. The number Bumpy called from that hallway payphone belonged to an office at 270 Broadway, the address of New York's surrogate court building, which also housed various city offices, including some connected to Tammany Hall's remnant power structure. The call was answered by a secretary who worked for a man named Thomas Coughlin, 59 years old, one of the last powerful fixers left from Tammany Hall's golden age of political machine control. Coughlin wasn't elected to anything, held no official position, but he knew everyone, owed favors to half of New York's power brokers, and was owed favors by the other half. Coughlin and Bumpy had known each other since 1943, when Bumpy had helped organize Harlem voters for a city council election that Tammany Hall desperately needed to win. The relationship had been mutually beneficial for 14 years. Bumpy delivered votes. Coughlin provided political access and occasional intervention when legal problems arose. But this situation was different. This wasn't a minor arrest that could be fixed with a phone call to a police captain. This was a federal racketeering case with 14 months of investigation behind it. Getting it dismissed would require pressure at the highest levels and calling in favors that Coughlin might not be willing to use. According to later accounts, some confirmed, some speculative. Here's what happened after Bumpy's call. 3:17 p.m. Coughlin's secretary transferred Bumpy's call. Bumpy explained the situation. Arrested, being pressured to provide testimony against Genovese's family operations, facing 7 years if he didn't cooperate. He needed the case killed. Completely. Immediately. 3:19 p.m. Coughlin asked what Bumpy could offer in exchange. This wasn't charity, it was transaction. Bumpy mentioned that he had documentation about certain police corruption in Harlem that could be problematic for some officials if it became public. He also mentioned that election season was approaching and Harlem's votes would be crucial for several races. 3:22 p.m., Coughlin said he'd make some calls. 3:23 p.m., Coughlin called James Moran, a political operative with connections to the mayor's office and the Democratic Party leadership, explained that a situation had developed involving Ellsworth Johnson that could become politically complicated. That Johnson had information that might embarrass people. That would be better for everyone if this case quietly went away. 3:26 p.m., Moran called Deputy Mayor Henry Epstein to brief him on potential political problems if the Johnson case proceeded. Mentioned that Johnson had Harlem connections that could affect upcoming elections. Suggested that the DA's office might want to reconsider priorities. 3:28 p.m., Epstein called Frank Hogan's chief assistant, Alfred Scotty, to express concern about political implications of the Johnson prosecution. Didn't order anything, couldn't, legally, but made clear that certain people were watching this case and hoping for a particular outcome. 3:30 p.m., Scotty called Hogan at home. The DA had left the office early for a medical appointment. Briefed him on the political pressure. Hogan was furious but pragmatic. Asked how strong the case actually was. 3:32 p.m., Scotty admitted that while they had evidence, some of it came from questionable sources. That wiretaps might face legal challenges. That star witnesses had credibility issues. That a good defense attorney could probably get charges reduced significantly. 3:34 p.m., Hogan made a decision. If the case was strong enough to withstand political pressure, they'd proceed. But if there were genuine legal weaknesses that political heat merely exposed, better to cut losses now than proceed to an embarrassing trial loss. 3:35 p.m., Hogan authorized Scotty to have Rothstein review the case for weaknesses. 3:37 p.m., Scotty called Rothstein at the DA's office, told him Hogan wanted a complete reassessment of case strength before proceeding. That's when Rothstein was called out of Interrogation Room 3 to take the call. And when he reviewed the case under Scotty's skeptical questioning, the weaknesses became apparent. Witnesses with criminal records. Financial documents that showed money movement but didn't definitively prove illegal activity. Wiretap recordings that were circumstantial at best. It wasn't that the case was impossible to win. It was that winning would require significant resources, extensive trial time, and political capital, all for an outcome that was no longer certain given that Bumpy would now know to mount a vigorous defense. 3:41 p.m. After 10 minutes of being grilled by Scotty about case weaknesses, Rothstein reluctantly admitted the case might be stronger in theory than in practice. 3:42 p.m., Scotty made an executive decision. Release Johnson. Drop charges. Claim insufficient evidence. Move on. 3:43 p.m., Scotty called Rothstein back, delivered the order. 3:44 p.m., Rothstein, humiliated and furious, returned to Interrogation Room 3 to release Bumpy Johnson. 41 minutes. One phone call. 14 months of investigation destroyed. Bumpy Johnson walked out of the Manhattan DA's office at 3:31 p.m., collected his property at the desk, wallet, watch, keys, $347 in cash, and stepped on a Leonard Street where Benjamin Benny Williams was waiting beside a midnight blue Cadillac. Benny had been Bumpy's driver and security chief since 1947. He'd received a call 2 hours earlier from Mamie Johnson saying that Bumpy had been arrested and would probably need a ride home later. Benny had been circling the block for 90 minutes, waiting. "They let you go?" Benny asked as Bumpy climbed into the back seat. "They did." "Ow, I made a call." Benny pulled into traffic, heading north toward Harlem. Must have been some call. It was adequate. They rode in silence for several blocks before Benny said, "There's going to be consequences. The DA's office doesn't like looking weak. Rothstein's going to want revenge. Let him want it. The case is dead. Can't be refiled on the same charges. Double jeopardy. They'll come after you another way. They've been coming after me for 30 years. I'm still here. But Benny was right. The humiliation of releasing Bumpy would echo through the DA's office, and someone would pay the price. That night, Martin Rothstein sat in his office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at the case files spread across his desk. 14 months of work, 17 witnesses, dozens of wiretap recordings, hundreds of hours of surveillance. All worthless because one phone call from one criminal had triggered a political chain reaction that reached high enough to kill the case. Rothstein wasn't naive. He understood that politics influenced prosecution decisions. But he believed, genuinely believed, that Frank Hogan's office was above that kind of pressure. That evidence and law mattered more than political connections. Today had taught him otherwise. He picked up the phone and called his friend David Shunn, an investigative reporter at the New York Herald-Tribune. David, it's Martin Rothstein. I want to have a conversation off the record about how political pressure influences the justice system. This about Bumpy Johnson? How did you know? Because my editor got a call this afternoon suggesting we not cover his release. That would be better for everyone if the story stayed quiet. Rothstein was quiet. Who called? Someone from the mayor's office. Didn't give a name. Just said that covering the Johnson case would be unhelpful to community relations. Jesus Christ. Welcome to New York, Martin, where power and law are two different things. The next morning, January 18th, 1957, a small article appeared in the Amsterdam News, Harlem's leading black newspaper. Harlem businessman released after questioning. The article was brief, vague, mentioning only that Ellsworth Johnson had been questioned by the DA's office regarding business matters and subsequently released without charges. No mention of racketeering. No mention of the 14-month investigation. No mention of political intervention. But word spread through Harlem faster than any newspaper could print it. By mid-morning, everyone knew. Bumpy had been arrested, had refused a lawyer, had made one phone call, and had walked out free. The story grew with each retelling. In some versions, Bumpy called the mayor directly. In others, he called a judge who owed him favors. In still others, he called a mob boss who pressured politicians. The details varied, but the core message remained consistent. Bumpy Johnson had connections powerful enough to destroy a federal case with one phone call. That perception, deserved or not, enhanced his reputation enormously. If you were a number runner considering working for a different operator, you remembered that Bumpy could get you out of legal trouble. If you were a rival operator considering challenging his territory, you remembered that he had political protection you didn't. If you were a civilian in Harlem who needed help with city bureaucracy or police harassment, you remembered that Bumpy had connections everywhere. The phone call became legend. Not because of what actually happened. Most people never learn the specific details. But because of what it represented, power that operated above the law, connections that couldn't be broken by prosecutors or police, and a sophistication that separated Bumpy Johnson from every other criminal in New York. But there were consequences beyond reputation enhancement. Detective Sergeant William Murphy, who'd been in the interrogation room, filed a complaint with his supervisor arguing that political interference in prosecutions undermined law enforcement. The complaint went nowhere, was actually suppressed, but Murphy's career stalled. He never made lieutenant, never got promoted beyond sergeant. 23 years of service, and he retired in 1972 at the same rank he'd held in 1957. Assistant DA Martin Rothstein stayed in the office another 3 years, but the Johnson case haunted him. He'd been made to look foolish, weak, politically naive. When he left the DA's office in 1960, it was for private practice, not the judgeship he'd been angling for. The political connections he needed for appointment had been damaged by his public humiliation. Frank Hogan, the district attorney, never spoke publicly about the Johnson case. But according to his deputy Alfred Scotty, Hogan was furious about the political pressure and vowed to be more careful about which cases his office pursued against politically connected defendants. The Johnson incident taught him that evidence alone wasn't enough. You needed to assess political exposure before committing resources to high-profile prosecutions. Thomas Coughlin, the fixer who'd made the calls, collected his favor from Bumpy 3 months later. A close election in Harlem's 13th district needed organizing. Bumpy delivered, mobilized his network, got voters to the polls, ensured the Tammany-backed candidate won by 1,847 votes in a race decided by margins. The cycle continued. Favors given, favors owed, power exercised through relationships rather than force. If you've been following this story, you understand something crucial about how real power operates. The law is important. Evidence matters. But in complex political systems like New York City in 1957, connections often matter more than both. And the people who understand that, who build those connections systematically over decades, can accomplish things that seem impossible to people who only understand formal authority. Bumpy Johnson understood that better than anyone. 3 weeks after releasing Bumpy Johnson, Martin Rothstein attended a reception for newly appointed judges at the New York Bar Association. It was the kind of networking event that young prosecutors attended to build relationships with the judiciary, meet senior attorneys, and advance their careers. Rothstein was standing near the bar, nursing a scotch and trying to forget the Johnson humiliation when someone tapped his shoulder. He turned to find Raymond Marcus, a prominent defense attorney who'd represented numerous Harlem clients over the years, including occasional work for Bumpy Johnson. Martin Rothstein, good to see you. Mr. Marcus, congratulations on the Johnson case. Rothstein's face tightened. Congratulations? You're alive. You're still employed. You didn't end up on the wrong side of the political machinery that runs this city. That's worth celebrating. I had a solid case. 14 months of investigation. I should have one. Marcus sipped his drink. Can I tell you something? Off the record. As education, not mockery. Go ahead. You never had a chance. Not because your case was weak, though it had weaknesses. You never had a chance because you didn't understand who you were prosecuting. A criminal, a racketeer, a political operator who spent 30 years building relationships with everyone from city councilmen to judges to party bosses. You thought evidence and law were enough. But in New York, there's always a layer above the law. And Bumpy Johnson has access to that layer in ways you never will. That's corruption. That's reality. You think Frank Hogan doesn't know this? You think he's naive about how power works? He knows. But he also knows that fighting every political battle destroys your ability to win any of them. So he picks his targets carefully. And when he realizes a target has connections that make prosecution politically expensive, he cuts his losses. So criminals with political connections just get away with everything. No, they get away with things until they push too far or until political winds shift and their connections don't protect them anymore. But in the meantime, yes, they operate with more freedom than criminals without connections. Marcus finished his drink. Here's what you should have done, Martin. When you first started investigating Bumpy Johnson, you should have asked yourself, who does he know? Who does he owe? Who owes him? What political pressures might I face if I pursue this case? And is the case strong enough to withstand those pressures? I had 17 witnesses. With criminal records, who could be discredited? You had financial documents that showed money movement but didn't definitively prove illegal activity. You had wiretaps that were circumstantial. A good defense attorney would have torn that apart. But you never even got a trial because the political pressure killed the case before it started. Rothstein was quiet, absorbing this. I'm not trying to discourage you, Marcus continued. I'm trying to educate you. The law is important, but it's not the only thing that matters. If you want to be successful as a prosecutor in this city, you need to understand the political landscape as well as you understand the law. You need to know which battles you can win and which ones will destroy you. And the Bumpy Johnson case was one you could never win. Not because you're not good at your job. You are. But because he's better at his job than you are at yours. And his job is understanding power. Marcus walked away, leaving Rothstein alone with his scotch and his education. Years later, in 1963, a journalist named Ted Poston from the New York Post managed to interview Bumpy Johnson for a profile piece. Toward the end of the interview, Poston asked about the 1957 arrest and the legendary phone call. Mr. Johnson, everyone in Harlem has a theory about who you called that day. The mayor, a judge, a mob boss. Can you tell me what actually happened? Bumpy smiled. I called a friend who knew people. That's all. But the charges were dropped within an hour. That's not normal. That's extraordinary political intervention. Or it's a prosecutor realizing his case had weaknesses and deciding to cut his losses before embarrassing himself in court. You really believe that? Bumpy was quiet for a long moment. Then, I believe that power operates on multiple levels. The law is one level. Politics is another. Relationships are another. Information is another. Most people only understand one or two of those levels. The people who understand all of them, who know how to operate across all of them simultaneously, those are the people who survive. And you understand all those levels? I've spent 40 years learning them, making mistakes, building relationships, understanding how this city really works. So when I needed help, I knew who to call. I knew what buttons to push. I knew how to activate the machinery that operates above the law. Doesn't that make you cynical about justice? No, it makes me realistic about power. Justice is a beautiful ideal, but power is the currency that actually determines outcomes. And if you don't understand that, you'll spend your life wondering why good cases lose and bad people win. The interview was published in the Post on March 17, 1963. It caused some controversy. Critics accused Poston of glorifying a criminal. Defenders argued he was documenting reality rather than endorsing it. But the interview crystallized something important about Bumpy Johnson's legacy, that his real genius wasn't in running numbers or managing criminal enterprises. It was in understanding how power operates in complex urban political systems and leveraging that understanding to protect himself and his community when formal authority came calling. On January 17, 1957, they laughed when Bumpy Johnson refused a lawyer in custody. Assistant DA Martin Rothstein laughed because he thought he was about to destroy a criminal without even facing competent legal defense. Detective Sergeant William Murphy laughed because he thought Bumpy was committing legal suicide. The public defender laughed, or would have, because representing yourself in a federal racketeering case was professional malpractice by any standard. But the laughter ended after a single phone call that demonstrated something prosecutors and police had failed to understand: that Bumpy Johnson's real power had nothing to do with violence or criminal enterprise. It was about relationships, about knowing who to call, about understanding that in New York City in 1957, the formal justice system operated within a larger political ecosystem, and the people who understood that ecosystem could accomplish things that seemed impossible to people who only understood law. 41 minutes after Bumpy made his call, he walked out of the DA's office a free man. 14 months of investigation destroyed. An ambitious prosecutor humiliated. A detective's career stalled. And a legend enhanced beyond anything money or violence could have achieved. The story spread through Harlem like wildfire. Bumpy Johnson, the man who beat the DA with one phone call. Bumpy Johnson, who had connections so deep that federal cases disappeared as word. Bumpy Johnson, who understood power better than the people wielding badges and law degrees. None of it was quite accurate. The reality was more mundane, more political, more transactional. But perception mattered more than reality. And the perception that Bumpy could destroy legal cases with one phone call made him more powerful than any amount of actual legal immunity could have. Martin Rothstein learned a painful lesson that day: that evidence and law aren't always enough. That political connections matter. That some defendants are too well protected to prosecute successfully. He carried that lesson through the rest of his career, became more cautious, more politically aware, more realistic about which cases to pursue. And Bumpy Johnson? He continued operating in Harlem for another 11 years until his death in 1968, never convicted of any serious crime despite being arrested over 50 times, protected not by lawyers or legal technicalities, but by relationships that ran deeper than the law could reach. The phone call became his defining moment. Not the violence, not the criminal enterprise, but the demonstration of sophisticated political power that separated him from every other street criminal in New York. They laughed when he refused a lawyer. The laughter ended after one phone call, and everyone who witnessed it learned the same lesson, that in cities like New York, knowing who to call matters more than knowing the law. That power operates on levels most people never see, and that the people who understand those levels, who build relationships systematically over decades, can accomplish things that formal authority cannot prevent. Bumpy Johnson understood that better than anyone. And one phone call on January 17, 1957 proved it to everyone who'd ever doubted.